They told them they were going home, back to the land of their ancestors, where chains no longer clinked and no man called them slave. But when the ships reached the African coast, the truth was waiting darker than the ocean behind them. The land they called Liberia, the land of liberty, would soon bleed under the same whip they thought they had escaped. They came as freed men and women, carrying the Bible, laws, and dreams of equality, but they brought with them the same system that had once destroyed them. And as their new nation rose from the ashes of colonialism, another empire was already watching. An empire of profit and power, built not on faith, but on rubber and blood. This is a forgotten truth behind the land of the free. A story of betrayal, greed, and human suffering that history tried to bury beneath smiling flags and golden promises. This is the story of the Rubber King, the Blood of Liberia. The year was 1821. The Atlantic Ocean, once a graveyard for enslaved Africans, shimmered under the fading sun as American ships approached the West African coast. On board were men and women who had once lived in bondage, freed African Americans, filled with dreams of a home where no one could own them again. They called this place Liberia a new beginning, a land of promise. But behind this dream lay the shadow of the American Colonization Society, a powerful organization that wanted to solve the race problem in America by sending freed blacks away. Many of those boarding the ships believed they were returning to their ancestral home. But in truth, they were walking into a story written by men of power and profit. When they landed on the Pepper Coast, the air was thick with humidity, and the cries of native tribes echoed through the forest. The crew, Vi, and Bassa people watched cautiously from the trees, confused and wary. To them, these newcomers, dressed like Europeans and carrying foreign weapons, didn't look like brothers. The settlers called themselves Americo-Liberians, and they built towns that mirrored the world they had left behind. Churches, courthouses, and plantations rose from the soil, and soon a hierarchy emerged. The Americo-Liberians saw themselves not as equals of the natives, but as their rulers. "We came from a land of bondage," one settler wrote, "but we must teach these people the ways of civilization." It was the beginning of a tragedy, a cruel echo of history repeating itself. By the mid-1800s, Liberia declared independence, proudly calling itself the first black republic in Africa. To outsiders, it was a miracle. To the indigenous tribes, it was a nightmare reborn. They were forced to pay taxes to a government they never chose. They were ordered to abandon their customs, convert their faith, and serve a flag that did not protect them. Men who refused were flogged. Villages that resisted were burned. Freedom had become another man's weapon. In the early 1900s, Liberia's new leaders sought wealth and recognition. And when the white businessmen came, offering riches, they welcomed them with open arms. That's when Firestone Tire and Rubber Company entered the story, a name that would forever be stained with blood. In 1926, Firestone signed a 99-year lease for 1 million acres of Liberia's land, the largest rubber plantation in the world. The deal was signed with smiles, handshakes, and promises of economic growth. But no one asked the indigenous tribes what it would cost them. The forests that fed their children were cut down. The rivers that sustained their villages were poisoned. And those who protested disappeared. By 1927, thousands of Liberians were forced to work the plantations, tapping rubber trees from dawn till night, earning nothing but lashes and hunger. The same soil that had once been the dream of liberty had now become the field of suffering. The settlers, once victims of oppression, had become enforcers of it. The freed had become the masters. And in the heart of the jungle, a whisper began to rise. This is not freedom, This is slavery reborn. The world would soon learn of the horrors buried beneath Liberia's shining promise. But for now, the rubber trees stood tall, silent witnesses to the cries of the forgotten. They said Liberia was free. But who defines freedom? The one who gives it or the one who takes away? What happens when freedom becomes a business? When liberty is traded for labor and promises are written in blood? The year was 1926. The jungles of Liberia swayed under the morning sun, the air thick with mist and the scent of wet earth. But beyond the beauty, deep within the heart of the forest, an empire was rising, one built not by dreams but by chains. That year, the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, led by Harvey Samuel Firestone, struck a historic deal with the Liberian government. A 99-year lease, 1 million acres of fertile land, nearly 10% of Liberia itself, handed over to an American corporation. It was celebrated in the newspapers as a partnership of progress. But to the people who lived on that land, it was the beginning of another slavery. The Americo-Liberian elite smiled for the cameras, dressed in white suits and silk hats. They signed documents beneath fluttering flags, while brass bands played the national anthem. Liberia, they said proudly, is stepping into the future. But in the villages beyond Monrovia, the story was different. Firestone wanted workers, tens of thousands of them, but no one volunteered. Why would they? The pay was miserable, the hours endless, the conditions deadly. So the Liberian government passed laws that made forced labor legal in the name of national duty. Soon, soldiers began marching through villages, rounding up young men at gunpoint. Mothers screamed as their sons were dragged away. Those who resisted were whipped or shot. The captives were forced to walk for miles, barefoot, starving, to the rubber plantations near the Firestone base at Harbor. In those fields, freedom was just a word. Men worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, slicing rubber trees, collecting latex in small bowls. The white overseers barked orders while local enforcers, chosen by the Americo-Liberian elite, kept them in line with clubs and guns. "You are not slaves," one official told them. "You are laborers for the progress of your nation." But progress tasted like sweat, hunger, and silence. The forests that once fed their ancestors were now gone, replaced by endless rows of rubber trees. The rivers that once gave life now ran black with runoff and waste. And the screams of men dying from exhaustion echoed beneath the hum of insects and the crack of whips. In 1927, a British missionary named Reverend John Harris visited one of Firestone's sites. He described what he saw as a vision of hell, hidden behind a smile. Children as young as 10 were made to carry buckets of rubber sapped too heavy for their arms. Men fainted in the heat, only to be beaten awake. Villages that failed to meet quotas were burned. But it wasn't just Firestone's greed that stained the soil. It was the silence of those who knew and did nothing. The Liberian government, desperate for Firestone's money, ignored every cry for justice. The United States, Firestone's home, turned away, calling it an internal matter. "We have no slaves," the president of Liberia said in 1927. "Only workers serving their country." But the truth was undeniable. Reports of forced labor and human trafficking began to leak out. Stories of men shipped to the Spanish island Fernando P, sold to work in plantations under brutal conditions. Many never returned. By 1930, an international investigation was launched. The League of Nations sent a commission to uncover the truth. What they found shocked the world. A modern nation profiting from slavery, a corporation complicit in crimes against humanity. But when the report was released, names were redacted, blame diluted. Firestone continued its business. The Liberian elites kept their wealth, and the people kept suffering. In one forgotten village near Harble, an old man named Kanza, who had lost 2 sons to the labor camps, stood by the river at dusk. He looked at the glowing horizon and whispered, "We fought for freedom, but they only changed the chains." The wind carried his words through the jungle, through the rustling of the rubber trees, the silent witnesses of greed and betrayal. Closing cliffhanger. But Kanza was not alone. In the shadows, whispers were spreading. Of rebellion, of revenge, of a new fire rising in the heart of Liberia. If freedom won't be given, they said, then freedom will be taken. You can bury a man's body under the soil, but you can't bury his rage. And when rage finds its voice, it burns. The year was 1931. The jungles of Liberia whispered with something new. Not the sound of rubber tapping or gunfire, but a movement quiet and deliberate. The League of Nations had exposed Liberia's crimes, but nothing changed. Firestone still harvested its blood-soaked rubber. The government still denied the suffering of its people. And the men who toiled under the sun still died with empty hands and swollen hearts. But in the villages, the whispers grew louder. Among them was Kanza, the old man who had lost his sons to the Firestone plantations. He had once believed in peace, that truth could shame the powerful into mercy. But when he saw that even the gods were silent, he turned to the jungle for justice. Every night, men gathered in the darkness, deep in the forest where no overseer dared to go. They were farmers, fathers, hunters, men who had lost everything. With crude machetes, sharpened tools, and stolen rifles, they planned to take back what was stolen: their land, their freedom, their sons. The plan was simple, but desperate. At dawn, when the overseers gathered the workers for roll call, the jungle would come alive. Firestone guards would fall first, their weapons seized. Then the warehouses, the heart of the plantation, would burn. They called it the night of redemption. But rebellion never comes without betrayal. One of the younger men, tempted by promises of gold, ran to the authorities with their secret. By the time the rebels marched, soldiers were already waiting. What happened next was slaughter. The forest shook with gunfire. Men fell before they even reached the clearing. Fires lit the sky as huts burned, their flames reflecting in the terrified eyes of children. Those who survived fled deeper into the jungle, hunted like animals. Kanza himself was captured, bloodied, beaten, but unbroken. The soldiers dragged him before the Americo-Liberian governor, a man who wore a gold pocket watch and spoke perfect English. "Why do you fight your own brothers?" the governor asked. Kanza spat blood on the marble floor. "Brothers don't sell brothers to strangers." The governor sighed and turned away. "Then you have chosen death." Kanza was executed that same night, hanged beneath a rubber tree that he himself had once tapped. The guards left his body swinging as a warning to others. But warnings don't stop a fire, they feed it. When dawn came, more villages began to rise. Women hid rebels in their homes. Younger men fled into the forest, carrying the names of their dead as battle cries. And across the plantations, workers began to strike, refusing to work, cutting down rubber trees in secret. Firestone's profits plummeted. Foreign investors panicked. And for the first time, the world began to look again at the peaceful paradise of Liberia and see the blood beneath its soil. In 1932, an American journalist named William H. Allen published a report titled "The Black Republic of Chains." It described the torture, the forced labor, the hidden graves. His story shocked readers across the Atlantic, but once again, nothing truly changed. Firestone remained. The government denied everything, and Liberia continued to sell its soul for dollars and praise. Years later, long after Kanza's death, the jungle slowly reclaimed the old rubber fields, vines wrapped around abandoned tapping knives. The sound of workers' songs faded into the wind. But sometimes, when night falls over Harble, the locals say you can still hear the cries. Men chanting in forgotten tongues, calling out for the freedom they were promised and never received. Freedom, they whisper, wasn't given to us. It was stolen and still waits to be reclaimed. But this wasn't the end. A new generation was rising, one that would no longer beg, but take back what was theirs. The world called it progress. We called it pain, and pain remembers. Empires are not built by bricks or borders, but by the bones of those who dare to dream. And every empire, no matter how golden it shines, must one day face the ghost that built it. The year was 1945. The world was celebrating the end of World War II. Nations that had suffered under tyranny spoke of freedom and human rights. But in the heart of West Africa, the cries of forgotten still echoed beneath the rubber trees. Firestone plantations were thriving again, exporting thousands of tons of latex every year. America hailed Liberia as a beacon of democracy in Africa. But behind the iron gates and polished speeches lay the same truth: forced labor, corruption, and quiet suffering. In a village near Harble, a boy named Tamba, barely 16, listened to the old stories of Kanza, the rebel who had been hanged before he was born. Tamba had grown up under Firestone's shadow, watching his father work until his hands split, watching soldiers take food and daughters at will. His grandmother would whisper, "Your grandfather died for freedom." The jungle still remembers his name. And Tamba, like so many before him, decided that memory wasn't enough. He began gathering young men, the sons of workers, the orphans of the camps. They had no guns, no training, just courage sharpened by hunger and grief. They called themselves the sons of the soil. By night, they moved through the forests, cutting down rubber trees, symbols of their oppression. By dawn, they melted back into the villages, leaving behind messages carved into wood. The land will rise again. At first, the government dismissed them as bandits, but soon, Firestone's profits began to drop. Warehouses were burned, supplies vanished, workers refused to show up. And then one day, a convoy carrying the company's overseer was ambushed on the road to Monrovia. The man was found days later, alive but shaken, with a message pinned to his chest: "For every drop of blood you spilled, the soil will take its due." The government responded with fury. Troops swept through the villages, burning homes and arresting hundreds. But for every man they captured, 2 more rose in his place. The jungles that once wept in silence now thundered with defiance. It wasn't just a rebellion. It was the land itself, reclaiming its dignity. Tamba was finally captured in 1951 after an informant betrayed his camp. He was brought to Monrovia and paraded through the streets, bound and barefoot. Yet even as the crowd watched in silence, Tamba stood tall. A journalist who saw him that day wrote, "There was something in his eyes, not defeat but prophecy." Before his execution, Tamba spoke his final words to the governor: "You may kill me, but you cannot kill what I stand for. One day, your towers will fall, and this land will speak for itself again." They hanged him in the square, as they had hanged Kanza decades before. But history would not repeat forever. Years later, Liberia would face the very storm he foretold. Corruption and greed would tear the nation apart. Civil wars would rage. Empires would collapse, and Firestone, the company that had once ruled the land, would flee the same soil that had bled dry. And when the smoke cleared, only the forest remained, silent, eternal, watching. Today, the descendants of those workers still live near Harble. The old rubber trees still stand, their bark scarred with the cuts of another era. And sometimes, when the wind moves through them, the air carries an echo, a whisper of chains breaking, of names long forgotten, of justice finally breathing. Freedom, the jungle seems to say, is not given. It is taken, and it never dies. History remembers the kings, but the soil remembers the slaves. And long after the empire's crown has turned to dust, their stories still live.